A woman suffers a devastating miscarriage and gives birth to a lifeless baby. Desperate to bring her baby back, she digs up graveyard soil, places the child inside it, and kneads the dirt around the body. This lets the baby absorb enough dark spiritual energy before she purifies it with sacred fire. After 49 days, the ritual can reverse the boundary between life and death and restore the child. But this forbidden ritual is extremely dangerous. Before performing it, she carves a demon-sealing spell as a precaution. Unfortunately, the baby's resentment is too powerful, and it becomes a vengeful spirit that terrorizes the living. This is today's supernatural family horror movie, Mudborn. The male lead works as a virtual reality game designer. To capture authentic assets for a horror game in development, he sends a crew to scan a Rhea crime scene house. As soon as they enter, a fearless scanning technician spots a clay-firing kiln and decides to explore it out of curiosity. The moment he opens the kiln door, his flashlight starts flickering uncontrollably before shutting off by itself. Even so, the technician crawls inside. Then, without warning, the kiln door suddenly slams shut on its own. The man hears the noise while moving equipment and rushes over to the kiln. Strangely, no cries for help come from inside. As he wonders what is happening, the scanning technician silently appears behind him.
昌哥，你干嘛啦？
好东西，多漂亮！
It turns out the strange noise is just the scanning technician playing a prank. He then hands the Mudborn doll he found inside the kiln to his coworker. As the man carefully examines the grotesque doll, a strange woman's voice suddenly whispers in his ear. The sudden voice startles him so badly that he loses his grip. Only then does he notice a bizarre symbol carved into the Mudborn doll's back. An unexplained terror suddenly washes over him. He immediately turns around and tries to leave. But after only a few steps, a storage rack suddenly collapses and crushes him. Blood quickly spreads beneath the doll. Seeing this, the scanning technician rushes off to grab a tool and pry the rack away. But when he returns, he sees that the man who was unconscious moments ago is already back to his feet. He also fixes the technician with an ice-cold stare. The technician panics and tries to run. But the moment he takes a step, an unseen force yanks him to the floor. Another invisible force then drags him into the kiln. Before long, the injured man returns to the office with his hat covering the wound. His supervisor is in a hurry to meet with the investors, so he grabs the scan data without noticing the man's strange behavior or the bloody footprints covering the stairs. The virtual reality game's designer then uses the scan results to explain the old tragedy to the investors. Years ago, the homeowner suddenly snaps, wipes out his entire family overnight, and then dies, a bizarre position. Strangely, his wife's remains disappear without a trace and are still missing today. However, the investors show no interest in the case. Just as they prepare to pull their funding, the injured man rushes outside the conference room, pounds on the glass, and screams that she is coming and everyone needs to run. At that moment, the man's vision suddenly changes. In his eyes, the portrait of Lucien on the screen begins weeping tears of blood. To reassure the investors, Suchuan quickly explains that he staged the whole thing. Suchuan's quick thinking finally wins the investors back, but Ai suddenly becomes seriously ill and is rushed to the hospital. Finish developing the game as soon as possible, Suchuan takes Ai's collected data on and keeps working, including the mysterious Mudborn doll. Since it is already late, Suchuan reminds his pregnant wife to get some rest. His wife, Mu Hua, is an artifact conservator who has worked from home ever since becoming pregnant. But as soon as Suchuan finishes speaking, he sees Mu Hua appear on the other side of the room. Suchuan quickly turns toward his wife's workspace and finds it completely empty. At that moment, Suchuan suddenly hears his wife calling for him several times. He instinctively turns around. Only then does Suchuan realize he has been having a nightmare. He assumes it only happens because he is exhausted. What he does not know is that after the couple goes to bed, the air conditioner suddenly starts raising the temperature on its own. Even the bedroom door mysteriously swings open by itself. The sound of the door wakes his sleeping wife. As if under a spell, she walks into the living room, picks up the Mudborn doll, and gently strokes the crack in its head. Her husband's sudden voice startles her, causing the Mudborn doll to slice her finger and draw blood. She quickly sets the doll down and heads to the bedroom to confront her husband. But when she enters the bedroom, she discovers that her husband is still fast asleep. Meanwhile, the Mudborn doll silently absorbs her blood and begins singing an eerie nursery rhyme. She immediately turns toward the doll. In the next second, an evil force takes control of her, and her eyes turn an unnatural red. The next morning, her husband notices that her left eye is bloodshot, and her mood swings wildly. Even stranger, despite normally avoiding organ meat, she fills her porridge with pork liver. Although he finds this strange, he assumes the pregnancy is causing her sudden change in appetite, never realizing it is an early sign of possession. After breakfast, he heads to the office to test the game. He puts on the virtual reality headset and enters the Hsu family crime scene house. He suddenly sees the missing woman's ghost. She repeatedly warns him to put the doll back. But the ghost is supposedly the woman who vanished from the crime scene house, and he feels no fear at all. He only wonders why a scene he never designed appears in the game and assumes a coworker changed it. But when his coworker hears what happened, he believes the man may have encountered a Rhea ghost. After all, no one besides him has altered the game. The coworker who entered the crime scene house is still hospitalized. The scanning technician is also still missing. Meanwhile, his wife works on restoring a clay figure at home. When she notices the air conditioner keeps raising the temperature by itself, she assumes it is broken and switches it off with the remote. But as she prepares to continue working, she discovers that the clay figure on her desk has transformed into the Mudborn doll. Then she hears the air conditioner beeping behind her as the temperature rises again. Terrified, she tries to flee the workspace, but the door slams shut the moment she reaches it. In the next second, an eerie voice whispers in her ear. The woman instinctively tries to resist the temptation, but when she glances at the mirror, she sees her reflection holding the Mudborn doll. She looks down and discovers that the Mudborn doll has somehow appeared in her arms. Her other hand grips a carving tool, and her reflection controls her body, forcing her to carve in her chest. She feeds the Mudborn doll in her arms with her own blood. She then mixes the remaining blood with clay and uses it to restore the doll. During the restoration, she uses a tool to scrape away the spell carved into the Mudborn doll's back. By the time her husband returns home, half of the spell has been erased, and his wife is already asleep. Since he does not want to disturb her rest, he fails to notice anything unusual about her. Shortly after lying down, he notices the air conditioner raising the temperature by itself. He tries to switch it off with the remote, but nothing happens. Even more shockingly, his sleeping wife suddenly sits up and accuses him of disturbing her. She then scratches Despertel. She says she feels terrible. Her husband immediately rushes to her side. Only then does he notice her exhausted face and the alarming marks covering her abdomen. He assumes severe prenatal stress is causing her condition. Hoping to help his wife relieve the pressure, he spends every spare moment at work researching possible solutions. Fortunately, his supervisor is an older schoolmate who understands his situation, does not scold him for slacking off, and advises him to spend more time with his wife. He also gives him a protective charm and wishes the couple a safe delivery. His senior's advice finally puts his mind at ease. He returns to his desk and continues researching the game. To make the game more realistic, he reopens the footage from the Hsu family crime scene house. He finally notices the strange symbol carved into the Mudborn doll's back. Unfortunately, the footage is too blurry for him to make out the spell. Just then, the coworker who recently leaves the hospital suddenly calls him. He warns him to hand the Mudborn doll over to an occult expert as soon as possible. But during the call, the signal suddenly becomes terrible, preventing him from hearing the warning clearly. Concerned about his coworker, he goes straight to the man's home after work to check on him. Unbeknownst to him, as he approaches his coworker, his wife picks up a toy doll at home, cuts her palm with a blade, and smears her blood over it. Meanwhile, his coworker cries for help and repeatedly mutters about the Mudborn doll. When his wife suddenly twists the toy doll's arm out of place, his coworker's arm bends unnaturally as well. She then cradles the doll and twists its head. His coworker uses his other arm to wrench his own neck around and dies right in front of him. The horrifying sight leaves him utterly terrified. Afraid he might become the next victim, he rushes home and immediately examines the Mudbo doll for anything unusual. But he accidentally steps on a thumbtack. Several drops of blood immediately fall onto the floor. He then spots the toy doll his wife has thrown on the floor. Its twisted limbs and head instantly remind him of his coworker's gruesome death. Just then, something else catches his attention. He suddenly saw Muhua standing outside the work area, frantically pounding on the glass. But in the blink of an eye, she disappeared again. Then he heard Mudborn's voice in his ear again, demanding the crimson trace from him. The next second, Suchuan felt that something was trying to take over his body. Just as Mudborn was about to succeed, the protective talisman supervisor had given Suchuan suddenly activated, restoring his sanity. Unfortunately, the protective talisman now looked as though it had been scorched by fire and could no longer be used a second time. Suchuan also clearly realized that this Mudborn was anything but ordinary. So the next day, he took a photo of the talisman attached to the doll and went to occult scholar Sheng for help.
你这图上的先天符是一种叫禁锢符的古老符箓，专门用来封印厉鬼。
According to Sheng, there are some vicious ghosts in this world that cannot be banished and can only be sealed with talismans, and the Mudborn in Suchuan's possession is the vessel used to imprison such ghosts. But because the Mudborn was smashed, a corner of the talisman was destroyed, giving the vicious ghost a chance to come out and wreak havoc. In order to seal the vicious ghost again, Sheng came to Suchuan's house in person. But when Muhua, who was possessed by the ghost, saw Sheng, she charged straight at him without a word. But what Muhua didn't expect was that Sheng had already scattered salt on the flue specially meant to counter ghosts. As he exhaled a mouthful of smoke, Muhua immediately stumbled backward uncontrollably and fell to the ground. But then her eyes suddenly turned red. Then she developed double pupils. Seeing this, Sheng hurriedly threw the talismans he carried into the air, then chanted an incantation and formed hand seals, trying to force the vicious ghost out of Muhua's body. After failing repeatedly, Sheng immediately changed tactics. He smeared his own crimson trace onto the Mudborn. Sure enough, he successfully lured the vicious ghost into it. Sheng then attached a sealing talisman to the Mudborn. However, just as he thought he had successfully sealed the vicious ghost, the talisman unexpectedly burst into flames on its own. Seeing that Muhua was about to be possessed again, Sheng rushed over, tied a red ribbon over her eyes, then used a red cord and talismans to trap the vicious ghost inside Muhua's body. But this was ultimately not a long-term solution.
会吃血的鬼，不是什么简单的鬼，只要沾上一点血，他就一定会附你的身。
As for Muhua, she had already been possessed by the vicious ghost for a full 6 days. That meant if they couldn't restore the talisman before dawn, Muhua would completely become the ghost's vessel. Without wasting any time, Sheng and Suchuan hurried to find Liu Xin's younger sister, intending to use the siblings' familial bond to recreate the process by which Liu Xin made the Mudborn. That way, they would be able to learn the complete talisman. After learning about Suchuan's ordeal, Liu Xin's younger sister readily agreed. As Sheng began the ritual, the girl suddenly saw her older sister, who had been missing for many years. Back then, it turned out that Liu Xin, to create a different kind of Mudborn, she chose to use soil from a grave as the raw material. But while digging up the soil, she suffered a devastating pregnancy loss. To let the child live on in another way, Liu Xin mixed the child she had lost with the grave soil and fired them into a clay doll. But what she never expected was that, after the child she had lost absorbed the restless spirits within the grave soil, it transformed into an evil spirit. It even controlled her into turning against her husband. After Liu Xin regained her senses, to prevent the evil spirit from claiming more victims, she wrote a talisman to seal it away. And to atone for her sins, she sealed herself together with the Mudborn. Inside the kiln, after learning the whole story, Sheng and Suchuan hurried to Liu Xin's home to search for her remains. But unexpectedly, Muhua, under the evil spirit's control, came to stop them. She even locked Sheng inside the kiln, nearly trapping him in the kiln fire. Fortunately, Sheng had already given his exorcism token to Suchuan in advance and temporarily suppressed the evil spirit. Not long afterward, after finding Liu Xin's remains, Sheng, he intended to reseal the evil spirit within Liu Xin's skeletal remains, but to his surprise, he failed. Only then did Sheng finally realize that the evil spirit had chosen to possess Muhua, because it wanted to use the unborn child in her womb to be reborn. To stop the evil spirit from entering the human world, Sheng had no choice but to sacrifice Muhua and the child. But Suchuan stopped him. As a husband and father, I have to protect my wife and child. Suchuan let his own crimson trace drip onto the Mudborn. He was planning to let the evil spirit possess him instead. As soon as Sheng saw this, He immediately inscribed the talisman onto Sichuan's back. Although this successfully sealed the evil spirit, the price was Sichuan giving his life on the spot. Not long afterward, Muhua finally gave birth to the baby safely. But one day, she received a VR game that Sichuan had prepared before his final sacrifice. It turned out that because Sichuan was always busy with work and was chronically emotionally absent, he had uploaded his own data into the game. That way, he could remain as a digital echo, always by his wife's side. With its terrifying premise of spirits hidden inside dolls, Mudborn intertwines two tragic stories and fully conveys the weight of parental anxiety and redemptive sacrifice. Liu Xin's desperate self-sealing was a helpless mother's obsession with the child she lost. The male protagonist's redemptive resolve was a husband's protection of his wife and a father's selfless devotion to his child. More than the sustained supernatural dread brought by ghosts and evil spirits, the regret of irreversible separation and a family permanently fractured by absence are what truly break the heart. All right, that's the end of today's story. I'm narrator. See you next time.